Welcome to Peace Now. My name is Trudy Quaife. I'm a member of Bethlehem Neighbors for Peace. We're a local organization of friends and neighbors, and we've been advocating for peace and justice for well over a decade. I'm your host today, and I'm joined by Joe Lombardo.
Hello.
Thanks for being here, Joe.
Sure.
This is Joe's second time on the program.
Third time.
Third time? Okay. Let's start with a little background about Joe. He's one of the founding members of Bethlehem Neighbors for Peace. He's also a member of many other local organizations that promote peace and justice, including the Muslim Solidarity Committee, the Troy Area Labor Council or Federation, the Solidarity Committee. He was very active in Occupy Albany, and just about anywhere where people are advocating for peace and justice, you'll find Joe Lombardo.
Thank you.
Joe is also the co-coordinator of the United National Antiwar Coalition, also known as UNAC. So I thought we'd start with that. Joe, could you talk a little bit about why you think activism is important, and then from there maybe tell us a little bit about UNAC?
Yeah, well, I think there are some pretty negative things happening around the world. When I was young and you hear about wars, there was like one war a generation. Now there are continuous and simultaneous wars in one place or after another. They're not the kind of wars we've seen in World War II where big armies are fighting each other. They're mostly against small countries, and the civilians are right in the middle of it all the time. Many, many more civilians than combatants die in these wars. They're causing all sorts of internal problems in these countries, and these countries like Iraq or Syria or Afghanistan are ending up as failed countries that can't even support an economy and can't support their own people. We are now getting closer and closer with confrontation with a country like Russia, which, unlike Iraq, does have weapons of mass destruction. And so we're back into a period that we thought we were out of, where we had to fear a nuclear war of some kind. And we're seeing cutbacks in this country on civil liberties. A lot of that is related to the wars. We're seeing attacks on minority communities. Cops at will can pretty much kill a black these days in this country, and according to the Malcolm X grassroots movement, that happens by a white vigilante or a cop at the rate of once every 28 hours in this country. But cops just don't get convicted for doing that, even though if the crime is seen right on the screen through videotape. In some cases, the videotaper is the person that gets arrested and gets prosecuted. So there's a lot that people need to do, and unfortunately, I think the only way it really happens is through activism and building up mass support against policies that are wrong, and in some way you can stay the hand of the people that are doing those wrong policies. Mm-hmm. In terms of UNAC, UNAC is a national anti-war coalition. It's a coalition of local groups like Bethlehem Neighbors for Peace and regional and national groups from all across the country. It was founded here in 2010 at a conference of 800 anti-war activists. The conference happened in downtown Albany, and we've been going ever since. So we've built demonstrations against war. We've done national tours like Malila Joya, who appeared on this program. She is from Afghanistan, a woman activist leader that's been opposing U.S. involvement and the warlords in Afghanistan, and many other programs like that, educational programs and demonstrations and building activism. And so that's who UNAC is.
Mm-hmm. I remember the conference in Albany. I think there were over 700 people in attendance, which I think was a surprise to some people. Not
Yes.
a surprise to you, but...
Well, it was bigger than I thought it would be, but it showed that there was an interest, because what had happened was there were other anti-war coalitions in the United States, and some of them thought when Obama was elected that wars would end. Well, we've clearly seen that wars not only haven't ended, but they have increased, and so has the attacks on civil liberties in the United States. And it's just important that there be a visible anti-war presence in this country when our country is at war, to try to stop those wars. So while other coalitions kind of thought that things would end, we thought that we needed to continue with the movement, and so we built UNAC, which today is the largest and main anti-war coalition in the country.
Mm-hmm. I know you're also involved in many other issues. Some of the issues like the anti-drone protests, you've been involved in that. The Black Lives Matter. What are some of the other current issues that you're working on?
Well, I've always been a labor activist, a member
Right.
of CSCA, and still a member of the Troy Area Labor Council. And labor is under major attack in this country. Unions are at their lowest level than they've been in decades. Every time there's a clear violation of union rights, and it goes to the National Labor Relations Board. Going through that bureaucracy takes years and years, and the people that need salary on a day-to-day basis never get justice through these systems. And so we're hoping the labor movement can fill in the gaps there, and through protests and pickets and so forth, help some of these people that need help and help organize others, because the only way we'll get ahead is if we do that. The difference between the average working person and the average CEO in this country has grown so great, far greater than in any other country in the world or at any other time in history. And some of the wealth of this country needs to go to the people that produce all that wealth, and that's the working people. So that's part of it. And lately, of course, there's been militarization of the police. There's been mass incarcerations of in the United States. We have 5% of the world's population and 25% of the world's prison population. And so I've been working on some of these issues too, but they're not unrelated to the peace issue. A lot of them, such as the stop and frisk that has happened in the black communities, increased as we became more of a security state after 9/11, and as we started going to war on this ambiguous war on terror. And so that war on terror has a domestic component, and so anti-war activists have been active in those struggles also.
I also wanted to mention that you're a musician and that you really used your music to promote peace and justice, and I don't think we ever talked about that before when I interviewed you, so I wanted to mention that. And you've been a member of the Solidarity Singers for many years.
Yes. Yeah, we have a group called the Solidarity Singers. At one point, the labor movement in this area decided it was going to do something on May 1st, which is a traditional Labor Day of activism. In the United States, we have given up on May Day in many places, and instead we made a major holiday of Labor Day. And a lot of that was really to take the wind out of the sails of the labor movement that was organizing these May Day activities. So in this area, we decided a number of years ago to do May Day actions, and we do May Day actions every single year, and now that's happening in many places around the country. And because I and some other members of the labor movement did music together, we were asked to come together, and we stayed together as the Solidarity Singers and have been asked often to play. You know, in my growing up fighting against the Vietnam War in the period of the 60s when I was, a young man, and 70s when I was in college and so forth, music and folk music and protest music was very much part of the movement, and I think that's a wonderful tradition, and hope to carry it forward. However, I'm not much of a musician, but I love to play music.
Well, I've heard you, and I think you sound pretty good.
Thank you.
Let's go back to talking a little bit about UNAC. You recently went with a group of other UNAC members on a trip to Moscow to a Russian peace conference. So could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. What's happening in the world, which is very scary, and a lot of it is around the situation in the Ukraine, is there's becoming more confrontation between the United States and Russia to an extent that we haven't seen before. Right now, the U.S. and Western powers have imposed sanctions on Russia. The prices of oil, and oil is a big part of the Russian economy. The price of oil is way down. I mean, just a couple of months ago, it was up around $110, $120 a barrel. It's now down around $40. And usually what happens is when the oil prices go down, countries like Saudi Arabia that produces a lot of oil stop producing, so that supply and demand will bring the prices back up and they can make a lot more profit. But this time they've made decisions not to do that because they're trying to hurt Russia. And a lot of it is this idea that Russia has been playing a role in the Ukraine to try to stir up problems. But it's not that at all, of course. It was the United States that supported the coup over the democratically elected government about a year ago in the Ukraine. We heard Victoria Nuland speak on a TV, an interview that was intercepted on her phone, and she went down to the Maidan protests there with food and said, "You're doing a great job, overthrow the government." But on her phone conversation, she actually named the person that the Americans wanted as the successor and the next person after that coup. And that person, of course, became the next in power. The U.S. has been giving billions of dollars to Kiev to stop the resistance that's in the east to the coup and to the other problems, because Ukraine has had a history of right-wing activity right from the time of the Nazis. There was large sections of the population that supported the Nazis, and some of those organizations that helped kill the Jews, and destroy the Jewish communities and kill Jews in Ukraine still exist. They're members of the right sector and the Sloboda Party, and these are parties that the U.S. has been promoting and helping to play a major role in the Kiev government. In the East, they see it as an anti-fascist fight going on, and that the right-wingers are very much against using the Russian language, even though it's the predominant language in Ukraine. They want to use Ukrainian, which only 10% speak to the exclusion of everything else. About 40% speak it, but they speak both Russian and Ukrainian. So there's anti-Russian sentiment, there's been anti-Semitic sentiment, and so forth. And so they've been bombing and so forth in the East where there's been resistance. And right now there's a terrible war that's going on. But the U.S. is trying to get Russia to basically say, fine, you can take Ukraine, you can make it another NATO country, even though we've promised we wouldn't go into Eastern Europe where Russian former Soviet states. We have, and about 8 or 9 of them we sent in, are now part of UNAC, part of NATO, not UNAC. And so there's this conflict going on, and it's a serious conflict because Russia is a major power. And so some of the organizations in Russia are looking for allies and reaching out to the peace movement here, and they reached out to us and asked us if we would come to a conference and we could have a peace conference in Moscow to try to damp things down and have people on both sides see each other and meet each other and see that we're human beings and we don't want to be fighting with each other and all this kind of stuff. So we went, and 5 of us went. I was one of them, Mo was another, a leader of the Black Agenda Report who's on our national administrative committee, another man from Chicago who himself has been attacked by the FBI for his anti-war activity and is also activist in Palestinian rights actions, was there, and another man from New York City. And we were received very, very well. We learned a lot. The organization that invited us, called the Anti-Globalization Movement of Russia, is a new and young organization and groping around to try to find their own politics in a post-Soviet world, seeing if they, where they fit in, trying to figure things out. And so we were able to have discussions with them. We were able to go to this conference. We got tremendous amount of press throughout Russia. I was on the major TV stations and radio stations, and so were the other people, especially Margaret Kimberly, because they were very, very interested in what was going on around the Ferguson struggles and things like this. And in fact, we had a demonstration at the U.S. Embassy there organized by our Russian hosts in support of Michael Brown and Eric Gardner, 2 of the black men that have been recently killed by police, and around which there's protests continuing in the United States. And it was very interesting to do that in the middle of Moscow in front of the U.S. Embassy.
Now, you addressed the conference. In fact, you were the keynote speaker. Could you tell us a little bit about what you told the people at the peace conference?
I basically talked about what we see in the anti-war movement here as the problems, in Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Ukraine, And in all these cases, it's the United States. The United States has close to 1,000 foreign military bases. We have a military budget about that, equal to all the other countries in the world. And, U.S. and its allies, especially in NATO. And so I spoke about that. I also spoke about the general movement that's going on. We're learning a lot in the movement. We used to do a big demonstration in D.C. and all get on our buses and come home. But then we saw Tahrir Square where people stayed, and then Occupy tried to follow that, and they stayed until we were thrown out of the parks by the police and throughout every city in this country. But then when we saw Ferguson, they also emulated a little bit. They came out day after day after day and protested. And when some of the kind of reformist leaders went to them and said, okay, you got everybody's attention, now let's go home and register everybody to vote, they said, no, we're staying out in the streets. This is the only way we get justice. We've tried the system. We've tried going through the court system and the grand jury, and instead of the prosecutor prosecuting the case, he acted as the defense attorney, and it happens over and over again because of the relationship of these prosecutors and these DAs to the police force. They don't prosecute the police, and they wanted an independent prosecutor. They're saying the system doesn't work. We have to fight outside the system if we want justice in this country. And so they learned also from the movements that are going on, and we're learning a lot as we go along, and I express that in the talks. And we were all very, very well received. We all spoke. After a while, other speakers, from the eastern part of the Ukraine, from Italy, from other European countries, one after the other said, we just didn't know there were people in the United States like you. We thought everybody supported your government and what you're doing. And you could see, we were all sitting in a clump because there was simultaneous translation going on. So the translator sat in the middle of us and was telling us what was being said. Instead of looking out at the general audience, they all kind of looked in our direction all the time. And we were very well received, and the media was very interested in what we had to say. And so we now need to open up a little bit. We need to talk to people in other countries, let them know that there are differences between people that don't want war in this country and what our government is doing all around the world. And I think we will find tremendous allies and strengthen the movement for peace everywhere by doing that.
Okay, we have about 10 minutes left. I have quite a few more questions for you.
I'll try to be more
No,
brief.
you're doing great. You're doing great. One of the things I thought people might be interested in is what were the Russians that organized the peace conference? What were they like? What were they young? Who were they?
Well, they were all very young. The central organizer is a guy named Alexander, who, while we were there, turned 25. The oldest of any of them that we met was 29. He just turned 30 actually last week. On Facebook I said happy birthday to him. And so they're very young. So you have to think that they were babies when the Soviet Union ended. They don't know about the Soviet Union. And the political movement in Russia is kind of very new. It's like they don't have a tradition and a history, and they're groping around to try to find out what to do. Some of them, communism and socialism is still not a bad name in Russia. And the second biggest party in Russia is the Communist Party. And there have been many splits from the Communist Party that went on. Some of the people who were there were from some of these splits. There was also a woman who was the head of the Green Party in Russia, who was a member of this anti-globalization movement. And there are, a number of other people from different kinds of organizations, and people have different ideas from all of these organizations. They come together around a minimal kind of program against war and against the dominance of the United States around the world. They think rather than a unipolar world, which they call it, where the U.S. is the dominant power, there needs to be a multipolar world where there are many groups all around the world that influence power, and they might have different ideas on how to do that and so forth, and that everybody's right of self-determination needs to be respected. I don't know that I agree with those formulations, but that's where they've come to and so forth. So we had good discussions about that, and that's pretty much who they are.
Okay. Now, the U.S. has implemented sanctions against Russia as a result of the situation in the Ukraine. Could you see evidence of those sanctions, and what did you see in Russia? What is life there? How do they compare? How do working class people compare in Russia to the U.S.?
Well, we were only in Moscow, and I understand that Moscow and St. Petersburg, two of the major cities, are very kind of middle-class type, yuppie type cities and so forth, and that there's more poverty and so forth outside of some of those cities. So we didn't see any of that, and I don't really know if that's true or not. What we did see was Moscow, and Moscow is a beautiful city. It was lit up for Christmas in just the most amazing ways. When I came back, I realized, our municipalities don't really decorate for Christmas very much anymore, and you only see it in store windows or in people's private homes. But there, the whole place was decorated with beautiful, beautiful lights. The subway system was the most clean, incredible system, very, very cheap, with art in the subway stations and things like this. There was Wi-Fi on the trains. Everybody had cell phones. Everybody had iPhones, actually. That's the predominant phone that I saw. I didn't see any flip-top phones. And people look well-fed, well-clothed, and taken care of. And we didn't see any panic around sanctions or anything like that. We didn't see any panhandlers. We didn't see any of the poverty. Maybe there was other neighborhoods that we didn't see. Tremendous traffic. I've never seen such heavy traffic anywhere, any time of night, any time of day. And so, it was interesting seeing these people. That they have clubs and restaurants and all sorts of places. People are out and dressed well and so forth. However, we saw the ruble go down. We were there as Putin gave a 3-hour press conference, interesting press conference, and he talked about the problems with the ruble going down, with the sanctions, with the low oil prices, and said they had to more diversify their economy, because what they had done when capitalism came to Russia, investment went to the places where there was a good return, like the energy industry, and didn't go to build up the rest of their industry so much. So they were lacking there, and now they see they can't depend upon the West for trade in these things because of sanctions. So they have to reinvest in some of the heavy industry and clothing industry and so forth, and that's happening. But we didn't see any panic. At Christmas, we went to a mall, and we saw a lot of people carrying out large screen TVs. And I asked some of our hosts, why is everybody carrying a TV with them? And they said, well, they think the ruble's going to go down, and these are foreign products, so it's going to cost more to buy it if the ruble goes down. So while the ruble is here, they were buying it. So there's some of that we saw.
They're stocking up.
But we didn't seem worry or care, and the people by and large thought they were going to be able to weather this.
Maybe we should talk a little bit more about that situation with the Ukraine. And one of the things I'm wondering is, do you think the people of Russia are concerned that there may be a war with the U.S.?
Very concerned, and that's why they invited us. And we hear in this country a lot of vilification of Putin. After that press conference, I couldn't believe the headline on the CNN webpage. It showed this disgusting picture of Putin where he looked like an evil man, and they said the whole headline was Putin blames U.S. for all its problems. Well, we do have sanctions against them. Sanctions are probably hurting Europe more than they're hurting Russia, and Russia's reorienting its trade towards the east, but that's what they saw. So we see a lot of vilification there, but I think they are afraid, and you got to realize Ukraine is right on their border. They're in the eastern part of the Ukraine. There's Russians that have family members on one side of the border and family members on the other side of the border. They all speak Russian. They have the same culture. They have the same background, and they don't like the fact that the Russian language and Russian nationality is being attacked by these right-wingers, and that has led to a lot of the sentiment against Kiev that exists in the east part of the country. However, there's a very simple solution to the Ukraine, by the way. It's the Scottish solution. Let them vote. They've already had referendums in Donetsk and Luhansk and on Crimea, and they overwhelmingly decided against Kiev. So we won't let them vote like they voted in Scotland, because we know the outcome of that. Although we talk about democracy, we'd rather bomb them into submission than allow them to vote, because they will vote the way that the U.S. doesn't want them to.
Okay. What's your final word on the Ukraine? What do people need to know? What should they do?
Well, there's a tremendous war that's going on there. You don't get it in the United States. If you listen to the BBC News, you'll hear about it. Right now, there's tremendous bombing going on in Donetsk. It's going on in just neighborhoods. It's because not so much the military, because they know that the military, their defense forces are just trying to defend their cities. So the Kiev forces know that if they bomb into the cities, they can affect the defense forces and try to force them. There's very little of close-up fighting, because there's been tremendous defections from the Kiev army that have actually gone over to the other side. There have been the Kiev army's been defeated over and over and over again, but they're recruiting another 50,000 people. There's now a big anti-draft movement in the western part of Ukraine. There's an anti-war movement. I was able to get the contact information for the leader of the anti-war movement in the western part of the Ukraine. I spoke on Skype with her for about an hour just the last couple of days, and she believes 80% of the western Ukraine is against the war that they are conducting against the eastern Ukraine. It's not the east bombing the west, it's the west bombing the east, and the U.S. supports the west, and it supports these basically neo-Nazi organizations that are a major part of that struggle. And so we need to know about it in the United States. We need to see the destruction that's going on, and we need to try to stop our government from giving military aid and giving tremendous amounts of money and aid to Kiev to wage this war against its own people.
Okay, we're down to about 3 minutes, so I'm sure that UNAC is going to be having a conference in the future, and I'm wondering if you want to just talk for 1 minute about that, and will you be inviting the people that you met at the Russian Peace Conference to your conference?
Yeah, we will. Whether they can come or not, I don't know. Whether they get a visa into our country or not, I don't know. They might not, because and we'd like to invite the Ukrainians too, but whether they get a visa into our country, I don't know. So we will be having a conference in early May. It's our third conference for UNAC. This looks to be like a very interesting conference, because there's been so much struggle around black issues, around militarization of the police, among domestic issues, and against war that is happening. And we hope to bring all these people together into a conference, and we think this can be a real pole of attraction for the entire movement and make us much stronger. So I invite everybody to come. They can get information about it from our website, which is UNAC, UNAC Peace, unacpeace.org. And we'll have a registration page up for the conference in the next couple of days, but they can see the poster and some of the information. And we're getting keynote speakers and other panelists and so forth to be there, and we will discuss and vote on political issues at that conference.
Okay. Now, if people miss the conference, is there anything else you think people need to do other than educate themselves about the issues? What else should people do?
What really needs to happen is we need to have a more educated population, and they first have to understand some of the issues, which you don't really get through the mainline media. You'll get it from a show like this, but we're not on mainline media. They won't let us get on CBS. They need to understand that, and then they need to understand one thing higher, that the only way to change the situation once they understand it is for them to become active in the movement, into a group like Bethlehem Neighbors for Peace, and to UNAC. Go to our website, bethlehemforpeace.org or unacpeace.org, and learn how you can get on our email list, see the activities that we do, and join in some of those activities. It's very important, and I think we can play a major role. We see how the U.S. is very fearful of talking about boots on the ground, because they know the sentiment of the American people is against it.
Right.
So our sentiment can actually have a political impact. We need to make that sentiment manifest, and people have to get active in the movement, and that will be a big help for the whole world.
Okay, great. Thank you. Such a pleasure to have you on the show, Joe. Thank you so much.
Sure.
And thank you all for joining us. Please join us for future shows.